Hey there, Hidden Pro Podcast fans, friends, followers, and family. Bruce Kittle here, coming at you with a new show this week that's a little bit different. But as many of you guys know, our mission statement for the podcast is sharing the untold stories of the people and communities impacted by social and environmental injustice. And throughout this season, we've been working with George and a guest player, and then hosting a veteran through MVP, Merging Vets with Players. And the veteran has been kind of picking the charity that they support. And that's been great. But throughout the season, we'd like to take maybe a little bit deeper dive into some of these issues. And this week, we're really fortunate to have on Rhonda V Mcgee. She is a professor at the law school at the University of San Francisco. She's written a book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice. The interesting thing about Professor Magee is that she is also a meditator and a proponent of mindfulness. And what she has done over the past 20 years is worked with and woven the practices of mindfulness and what she calls mindful communication and or some restorative justice practices together in order to bring people together from different backgrounds in order to discuss race, share experiences, and stay engaged with each other through this process. And her belief in all of this is that by staying engaged, we can deal with both the personal, interpersonal, and systemic issues that racial injustice poses for all of us. So I hope you enjoy it. I would very much encourage you to check out her book. Again, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. Our conversation's really good. I'm hoping to get her back on for part 2 because we really didn't get to everything in the book. But we do get through some really great issues, looking at some definitions in that and some of the work and get into the mindfulness practices. So I hope you enjoy the show. She's a vibrant, energetic, passionate woman and very experienced in what she's doing. And we're really excited to have her on the show. And again, hope you enjoy the show, and I would check out her materials online, and we'll have all the links in the show notes. Thank you. Excellent. So I am truly, really honored. You and I were talking a little bit before. I've been hounding you for quite a while, ever since I first came across your book, and partly just because just the race issues were so well done in the book. And then I'm on this journey of, I started really getting, my daughter is a yoga instructor. And so I really got into yoga about 8-9 years ago. And then with that, meditation, and it's just been a journey ever since then. And so the combination of the mindfulness work in the book with race. And then of course, what really triggered a lot for me was I spent, 15 plus years doing restorative circles and dialogues, both in prisons, mostly in a criminal justice context, but a lot of school-based and community-based. So your processes within the context of having your race talks, really, I really identified really strongly with some of the safeguards, creating safe space, the format and all that. So there was just a lot that I really identified with. So I immediately hounded you, and we weren't able to do it. And you were so gracious. I saw you on the Mind Life app, and you did a great job on the podcast. So I had to give it another shot, and you're gracious enough to do that. So I guess I'll read, I have your bio here, if that's okay. I guess we should put something like that out. So let me do that.
You can do an abbreviated version if you want. I know there's a lot there. We can send people a copy of it, but I'm happy. It's a little embarrassing sometimes when I hear this, but it is me. So yes, I will go ahead and say. Well,
it's just part of that journey, and I think one of the things that makes it so rich. And I'm going to come back to this over and over. And I'm going to ask you about the core themes of the book. As we get started, just so that if we don't get to everything. But the one that really stuck with me was the messiness of personal relationships and the need through mindfulness to find the courage, kind of strength and capacity to stay engaged with people that when it's easier to walk away. That is one of the things. And your bio kind of reflects someone who has committed herself to finding the courage and found the strength to kind of wade in there. And you're just like, you're in the middle of the river, the current is going, you get hit with a log every once in a while, but your feet are firmly grounded, and we're going to stay in this river until whatever happens. We're going to be here. So the river has to learn maybe to go around you a little bit or whatever. I don't know. So anyway, okay. So Professor Magee, she is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco, chair of the board of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, a member of the Project for the Integration of Spirituality, Law, and Politics, contributor to mindful.org. At USF, she teaches, contemplative lawyering, immigration law, insurance law, race law and policy, and torts. She's an expert in contemplative pedagogy, race law, identity-sensitive pedagogy, critical race perspectives on the intersection of race and immigration, and probably a whole bunch of other as well. So JD and MA, I believe, as well. So, okay, did I get enough in there? Is that okay?
That's good. That's plenty. Thank you, sir.
Okay, all right. So let me see. So our mission statement is sharing the untold stories of the people and communities impacted by social and environmental injustice. And normally we do that in the season once a week, and we have George on with another football player because football fans like to listen to football people. And then we usually this year we're doing a partnership with MVP where we have a veteran on who's served, and we interview them about their transition and issues, and then they pick a charity for us. So we try to focus on a different charity each week from the communities where the games are played. So, however, a year ago, after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and we were kind of in the midst of all that kind of stuff, obviously racial justice for us fits under that umbrella pretty predominantly. And so we've done a series with the Players Coalition, which is kind of the social justice group arm of the National Football League with former and retired players, trying to look at the ways in which they're doing things, and had a few other guests on as well. So again, your book really kind of fit obviously right into that. And I think the beauty of it that really attracted me so much was that I think at times, like you note in the book, it's really easy to kind of walk away and ignore this stuff. And I really want to get into this too. It's like systematically we've been taught that we're not supposed to either see it, acknowledge it, or talk about it, and it's just kind of it's the water in which we all swim, and we're supposed to ignore it because that's just the way the system is. So anyway, but you're kind of pulling the covers back on that and giving us some tools to do that. So I'm really excited. So what I'd really like to do to start is I'm going to light a candle here, if that's okay.
All right. Please. Yeah.
Okay. And then, the way we do this. So when I was in Nashville, there's a circle group there, restorative justice group. And they actually, when they do the invites, they have a whole separate camera for just the candle. So they light the candle. And then when we do a Zoom circle, the candle's always like one of the participants, which is, I know it's kind of corny, but anyway, but we're sure
I don't think it's corny at all, Coach. It's beautiful.
Well,
beautiful idea.
Creating space, and sometimes a little bit of ritual, not so much in a religious sense, but otherwise can be kind of important. So what I thought, if you're okay about it, maybe I might guide in just a second. I've got my gong here. I might just hit the gong once or twice for our participants, and then maybe we'll just kind of settle in, kind of be quiet. And then what I want to do is I was going to read, if you're okay, or I'd invite you to if you want to, but I wanted to read your opening that you put in the poem, If the Path Could Speak. And then if you want to bring us out of it, like just let us a little silence, and then whatever guided piece that you want to do to bring us out of it, and then we'll talk. Is that okay?
Sounds beautiful. And I have my bell over here too. I can use the bell. I can use the bell to ring us out. Oh, how sweet. Yes. Exactly.
Okay, well, why don't you could ring us in, and I'll just get us settled, and then I'll read the quote, and then, and you can pull us out anytime you want. That's great.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. So Professor and I will settle in, and for all of those of you listening that's not very helpful. And for all of those of you listening and or watching, we invite you just to get settled, find a comfortable position, and whatever that is for you and whatever you're able to do. And if you're comfortable, just kind of close your eyes a moment. As we enter into what we consider to be sacred space, and invite you to take just a couple of deep cleansing breaths, as some of the things that we may talk about today could trigger or push, and the conversation will be held in love and respect in a way that we hope to honor all of the voices that may not be here, but yet will be recognized. So just invite you to take a great big breath. and let her go. And with each breath that you take, just pull in strength and courage and patience. And with each exhale, feel free to let go of whatever needs to be let go of, whatever doesn't serve you, and whatever's not needed for today. Again, we'll inhale, and we'll exhale any fear, any anxiety, any stress around the things that we're dealing with or that you're facing. Okay, so I'm going to open with I believe a poem. I'll call it "If the Path Could Speak" by Professor Magee. All right. Beneath these words rests the awareness of generations and of generations and of generations that have come before. The awareness that each one of us is a vital part of the earth that we call home, is of the water, the wind, the rain, the fire, and so inherently belongs. If the path could speak, it would say, we must assert that which already exists deep within us, namely a sense of kinship with all those with whom we share the earth, on repeat, in every language, unceasingly.
So thank you for the honor of sharing those words. And as we gather here together, the two of us in this call, and inviting everyone who is listening in to our voices as we engage in this conversation to allow the words that were offered. We must assert that which already exists deep within us, namely a sense of kinship with all those with whom we share the earth. Allow those words to settle in some ways, to resonate, ripple, provide part of the support and the foundation for the conversation to come. Each of us inherently belongs on this beautiful earth, or else we wouldn't be here. Somehow the earth is selected for our particular, very particular form of life, energy, love, way of knowing, way of being. So as we breathe in and out, allowing perhaps on the next in-breath, sensing what is well within you, and strong, and perhaps on the next out-breath, just releasing, relaxing a little bit more, feeling the contact between the body and what we call the earth, the ground beneath us, the air flowing through us, of which we are inherently a part and which we have shared with every human being on the planet at this time and that's ever lived. This earth, this precious way of being in these bodies with the earth, air, water, the elements as support and in us. We are the earth that walks and feels and can connect with one another. So perhaps taking a gentle scan from the feet on the floor up through the legs, the lower torso, upper torso, and noticing any ways in which we're holding, clenching any more than we need to, inviting a gentle relaxing of the shoulders, arms, hands. And as we continue the scan up through the neck region, the musculature of the face, the jawline, often we're holding a little bit more tightness than we need to, inviting just a softening appreciation of the body that got you here. Up through this neocortex, the part of the brain that's doing so much work all the time, up to the crown of the head, the back of the head. Feeling the aliveness in these different regions of the brain, now down through the back of the neck, the shoulders, and once again, relaxing, releasing, breathing in and out. Feeling the front and back regions of that upper torso, lower torso, legs, feet again. And just resting in this experience of life as you breathe in and out. Now, in the next few moments, as we draw this meditation to a close, the invitation is to just sense into what you know in your body and in your bones about what it means to come into contact with one another and be reminded of the difference that race can make. What it means to look out upon the world and see evidence of the difference that race can make. Noticing the thoughts, images, emotions, and or bodily sensations that come up for you when you hear me speak these words of invitation for us to turn toward rather than away from what we know about race and racism, the systems and all of the different ways that we've been trained to normalize a sort of hierarchy of value around race, to normalize inequality. Just notice what comes up, thoughts, emotions, sensations in the body right now as I speak these words. And the invitation is to bring right here, right now, kind of a conscious breath. So integrating our breathing practice right here, right now. Breathing in, breathing out, perhaps through the mouth a little bit, and allowing ourselves to release and exhale really fully. Again, once again, breathing in, sensing what is well within you, and breathing out in a way that allows a full release, letting go. Creating spacious holding for what you know about these difficult strands of our experience, to support a courageous turning toward an engagement with these aspects of our experience, with the hope of giving better than we got, of minimizing the suffering from here.
Okay. Well, we're probably good. We'll just come back next week and get on it. You first. Whew. Okay. Oh, sorry. Daughter giving me some kind of video instruction that I couldn't pick up. So anyway, sorry. Professor, thank you. That was great. So hopefully everybody watching will feel settled and connected and all that kind of stuff. So that'll be good. So, okay. And I'm just gonna make sure. Yeah, we're all good. All right. Sorry, I had a call in between. I didn't want to mess it up. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I guess if we don't get back to it, because the restorative justice part for me is a little bit down the bottom, but I hope people would get a feel for that, kind of a transition from normal space into what we call sacred space. And I don't know if you use that language, but at least in restorative dialogue circles,
Mhm,
that kind of transition by lighting a candle, a
mhm.
chime or gong, and doing a reading with some silence or something like that. It kind of helps the body, mind, spirit, emotional transition from kind of normal space into a space where we can honor each other's journey
Mhm.
and be a little bit more fully present with each other. So we
I
may or may not
appreciate
get,
that. Appreciate
yeah.
that very much.
So, okay, so if the path could speak, I think it does talk about it. You kind of got into it in the meditation a little bit. I don't know, but you chose that to open the entire book. So is there anything else you'd like to say about that to kind of frame up our conversation? Because I thought it was very beautiful and well written and a very nice opening for the book.
Mm, Thank you so much. I do think, mm, I think of this journey that we're engaging with today around creating spaces where we can really speak some truths that we often don't speak, talk about things that we've been trained not to talk about, and in so doing, just open up aspects of our own experience and open up to different things that we carry with us all the time that we often aren't giving space to. I think of how often we feel either alone in this effort, particularly aggrieved or challenged when it comes to talking about race. We got some wounds from our experiences that we're bringing. And so for me, having a way of entering into the conversation that reminds us that we all actually belong here on this planet. And that while there are these social dynamics, the dimension of the social realm and the lived reality of the time and places that we're in, whether we're in the United States of America as we are or elsewhere on the planet right now in 2021, October 2021, when we're recording this, really touching into the particular concreteness of these moments, but not losing sight of this sacred dimension. I think it's really, really much more important to have that multidimensional awareness when we are engaging around issues that might divide us, so much more important than we realize. And so I wanted intentionally to start the book with an invitation to open up the aperture on who we are, on what we are, on this mystery called life, with a sense of support for feeling our way into innate, inherent belonging and the kind of combination of humility and magnificence that seems to be the only right response to that. Perhaps adding with that a bit of compassion for what it's like to toggle back and forth from being in these concrete realities and trying to make ourselves kind of feel at ease and feel worthy in a world that's constantly trying to give us different messages about who matters and why and all of that. So that's real that we're in that. And certainly racism plays a role in structuring how and to what extent we feel comfortable, how and to what extent we feel valued, how different vulnerabilities, different sort of protections from being vulnerable that are embedded in the thing called racism. So that's all happening in the real concrete spaces and everyday experiences that we're in. But if we can turn toward the work of being more present to all of that, trying to dismantle it with the compassion that comes from wanting, again, as I say, to give better than we got, to minimize harm. Like for me, the link between the sort of broader sense of our belonging, our inherent belonging, and how we might engage around issues of race and racism. Well, there are many links, but one of the links to me is about compassion or the challenge. It's really a challenge that our communities are suffering from. Our lineages, our human history, if we look back far enough in any of our experiences, we know all of our lives have been touched by it. So it's that multidimensional awareness that invites a kind of broad set of commitments for reaching toward one another rather than away, and for trying to heal the wounds that the separations of racism embed in us, try and heal and dissolve those separations to make, things just a little bit easier in the lives of those around us who are suffering the most, and on the path for the generations to come.
Yeah. Okay. No, quite true. I guess later in the book, I think there's a place where you talk about it, that we're all one family, that we just kind of forgotten who we are, which I kind of connected with. And then, as I was, once we got this scheduled, I went back and reread the book just to kind of freshen up. And in my meditations, the two images that were kind of, and they're kind of within the meditation mindfulness realm anyway, is one that, there is no self, letting go of the ego, and this notion of this independent self, which is one of the myths and fictions of, particularly in the United States. And then the counter side to that, so this was kind of my yin and my yang for the last 5 days. Mm-hmm. There's no self, and then there is no other. Mm-hmm. And I think in the book you talk about othering, which I think we can get into or not, but those were kind of the dynamic that the more I was able to kind of visualize and mentally, enter into this notion of letting go of the self and then accepting there is no other, it kind of brought me into that sense where I felt really grounded into that notion of, my human connectedness, that mm-hmm. I think you talk about I think it's humanity consciousness. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm hitting on exactly, but there was that kind of sense that, we're all connected to that life source, and we're all into that. And sometimes we walk around thinking that we're completely separate, but in reality, we're not. And if we can just set down all those defenses that we carry around all those masks, that maybe we can kind of enter into that. So, Okay. Well, thank you for that. So let's see. I don't know, because we can't be on here I would be on here for 3 hours, but we can't. So I don't know. I was going to invite you. So I was thinking back in my law school days, one of my professors in my L1 courses kind of talked about, he would always at the very beginning of every class give you the 3 core nuggets, he called them, for the class. And so at least if you wrote those down, you didn't get anything else, you kind of, at least you knew something that was going to be on the test. Something. Right. Because otherwise, 45 minutes go by and you're like, what did we talk about? Anyway, I just wondered within the book, and I certainly have my core takeaways of some of this stuff. I didn't know if you want to, and if you don't want to, we can just dive into, because I want to start into the race stuff here. Yeah. But I didn't know if there was 2 or 3 core themes or messages, if you want to just hit them up front, if there was anything like that you wanted to summarize. And if not, it's okay. I just wanted to give you that opportunity, because you are a law professor. And and we might get into the weeds a little bit on some stuff. So I just wanted to give you a chance to give people kind of a core message if there was one that you wanted to share, which I know you've already kind of hit on some of those things. So, but if there's something you want to add or summarize, I just wanted to give you a thought for it.
I mean, I think that one is, I guess I do want to open up the aperture of the sense of what we're up against. Because I think we can so often in our culture be trained to think, all I have to do is go take a webinar or a course, a training somewhere, and I will have have sufficiently addressed my biases, right? And of course, as a book author, we're guilty too of read this book, but it is both and. It's do this work, read the book, go to that webinar, whatever it is, but recognize that we're talking about a lifelong engagement with sort of waking up and being present and working on this, because, what it is, these dynamics are part of our embeddedness in a social world that has been in progress for generations and generations. And the patterns we're seeking to disrupt are, they have centuries and centuries old in this country. And of course, have a global analog. So humility is really, I think, courageous humility. We can do something, but we might as well settle in for the ride, if you will. Settle in for this one, because it's going to take really our willingness to engage around these issues for the rest of our lives if we're really going to maybe make a little bit of a dent. I think actually I may be wrong. And at the same time, so that's one thing. This is a lifelong. This is the taking our practices for being in wise relationship with reality to that next level. And one of the reasons, and this may segue to this maybe the second main point. We've got to be willing to be on the lookout for ways that we get stuck as individuals, and recognize that this is so, if it's so for us, it can be so for, our people that we're working with and people we'd like to work with, but we see as really on another path, and we find it hard to communicate with them. It's very, the research has shown, it's very common, even amongst people who have the will to be in these conversations, for there to be a gap between stated values and actual sort of hidden values and things that we're willing to do in the world, right? So the hidden values are often running what we're doing, because we're always acting from some value. And if we have some stated values, and if what we're doing isn't somehow in alignment, that is a tell that there's some other values that we need to be courageously willing to acknowledge. And, find a way to be in integrity as best we can in relationship to the real values that we're living. Right. And that's hard. That's like humbling to say, okay, all right, I got the stated values, or what am I doing? How am I living this? It's humbling for all of us. And so here we are. We need these sort of compassionate communities to help us. And also we need to stay engaged to be accountable around these things. And similarly, intent versus impact. That's a gap also that we want to mine. Because sometimes we have the intent to act and be in a certain way, and we very consciously we are doing that. And then if we're courageous to ask, how is that, what's the impact? And to be willing to listen without defensiveness. Again, I'm pushing us toward the kind of edgy invitations of this work. And but I just wanted to highlight those pieces.
No, and I appreciate that. So, I think it's one thing about the book, when you read it, like you enter into it, and then you kind of get through some of the race stuff, and, you're putting all this, reality out there, and kind of gently guiding people through the guided meditations. And if somebody hasn't read the book, really is a beautiful workbook for that, with a lot of support, with that kind of thing. But it does take you kind of in that direction, as far as you're thinking, okay, she's got a fix-it book for me, and we're going to get over racism really easy. And like the core theme that comes through, like just a bat hitting inside, but gently, is this is a long haul. It's been, 400 or 500 years. And by the way, it's built into every system that exists everywhere. And it runs really deep. And all of us, we didn't pick our bodies. We didn't pick our families of origin. We didn't pick our context. And we've all been socialized and contextualized in those kind of ways. And we all have embedded lessons. And oh, by the way, and I was thinking about this the book, but I'm a huge Matrix fan, with Keanu Reeves and all that. But there's an underlying system that operates, and it almost has a consciousness of its own that trains people not to have conversations, to be afraid, to don't mention this. And then that's, I think, what you called the white bargain is, if all you white folks just kind of don't, be good liberals, say you kind of want to do the right thing, but don't raise too much hell, and you get to enjoy all the privileges because you got the white skin. And so that was kind of the white bargain. So you can kind of go to those dinners and potlucks and all that bullshit, but don't shake the system too hard, because if you do, then we're going to have to punish you. Yeah. So
Exactly.
there's all that. So I've got lifelong commitment. And so that was really came through. You're like, wow, there's, like the engagement piece, it's not like there's like the reward at the end is really for my grandchildren or great grandchildren. And there's no,
and there is some reward right now, just in these moments, right?
Yeah, no, there is,
Right.
but it is like you are always, it requires you to consistently lean in, and just the practice of ongoing awareness and mindfulness in all of those situations is, to say the least, a bit exhausting. It can wear you down.
Yeah.
And engaging with people that you have such deep fundamental differences with at times. And I know there's a whole spectrum, so I don't want to paint it that way all the time, but those are hard conversations, which you did a nice job in the book too, sharing a few of those examples. So anyway, so that lifelong engagement. And then part two, what I wrote down was, be sure to be grace-filled and non-judgmental with yourself and others is kind of what I got. And so just because it's not perfect, and the Buddhist piece, it's not permanent, not perfect, and not personal. I kept those resonating for me within this mindfulness journey as well, that we hope this isn't permanent, but, and it's not going to be perfect. Our efforts in having race stories or race dialogue conversations, it's not going to be perfect, and it's going to be tough. And then also, it's not inherently personal. It is on the one hand, particularly if you're suffering and or microaggressions and those kind of pieces. But then on the other hand, it's so much bigger and systemic than just you, that the one person who really pushes all your buttons because of the way they believe, it's not personal to you. It is in the moment when it happens,
yes.
But it's not personal in the sense that what that person carries is so much bigger than any of us individually. So, okay. All right. Those are great nuggets. Okay. So then I was always struck when I read a book, I'm always struck up a little bit about how the author organizes it. And maybe I'm reading, so we don't have to do much of that, but you have 5 parts: the grounding, the seeing, the being, the doing, and the liberation. And as I, especially when I reread it the second time, I was really paying attention to that. So that all made a lot of sense to me, kind of in that. And then it's really interesting too, because the themes do, though, they kind of weave like a river through all, it's not like completely bifurcated,
right.
So I was kind of thinking it would be when I saw the structure, because I thought, it'd be kind of in the mindfulness set, like stage 1, blah, blah, blah. But even that's kind of circular. So, because the one thing you do talk a lot about is it's personal, interpersonal, and the systemic. There's those 3 levels that we're working on all the time. And as you read the book, it really does that. And so the grounding kind of opens it up. The seeing is developing, I think, the courage to see and be aware of these issues. And then I thought you did a great job too of being really grace-filled, in the sense you don't really have to know what to do with it once you start seeing stuff you've never seen before. All you have to do is give yourself permission to be in that space. And that's, it's kind of the allowing and accepting. That's the rain piece that you talked about. And I do want to talk about that. And I've done some of that work with our show as well. So that piece, so the seeing, and then the being, and being in that moment, and the doing. So those pieces all connect. And then the liberation I thought was great, because really tied together. I thought really what I got out of that was be grace and love filled, and pay attention to your own healing and the healing of others, and really, and through the healing, because of the wounds and the story you told, I had that in there about, I think it was Dan, with his story about Rodney King, and that is super vivid for me, because and that just that story though, but I thought the point you made though was really good. And I mean, this inherently, but hearing it again about, every attack or aggressive move typically reveals some kind of wounded nature of that person from somewhere else. And so
that's so true.
And so the examples there. So, but anyway, I'm lathering on about my interpretation, but I didn't know, is there anything else, would you, framing the book up, on those parts, is there anything else you'd like to say about that, just as a guide, as we're entering into some of those conversations?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for really touching on so much of, in this concise way, what is presented in the book. And of course, I recorded the audiobook because I know it's easier for some people to just listen along and pause it, maybe do a practice, because I present these practices for reflection. So different ways of working with it are presented. And thank you for touching on so much of it. I guess the only other piece that I would offer, and it's been coming up a couple of here and there in the conversation we've had so far, is again, I see, I call it mindfulness. You can call it awareness practices, compassion practices, just opening up to reality. We can call it different things, this capacity that we're talking about. But I definitely see it as a bit of a counter to some of the dominant ways that you've alluded to, that we've been trained to think about so many things. So dominant culture and dominator cultures, which is a term I used to refer to, again, how racism, sexism, patriarchy, these things that are impacting all of us in different ways. We may groove with it or not, but we can't deny that we're all being conditioned by these dynamics that we didn't necessarily create, but they're definitely in the spaces that we interoperate within. So there's a way in which they're about hierarchies. They're about, power over as opposed to power with people who may move through the world differently, be different in some important way. So deepening our ability to understand our power, right? The impact we have, the fact that our actions matter, the fact that we have choice in terms of how we respond rather than react to things that happen to us. That's an important part of what we want to talk about, because racism ultimately is not just about there being diversity and, the 10,000 flowers and let's have intercultural engagement and we're good. It's about power dynamics, right? And normalizing and naturalizing account of, again, these sort of dominator practices of privileging and subordinating. And really, so to disrupt that is an invitation to kind of want to work with the right use of power, including recognizing, again, the very subtle, beautiful power we all have every moment, no matter where we are on a social or any other kind of hierarchy, we all have power. And so really feeling courageous about the fact that our lives actually already matter, and we are mattering together, and we can bring intentionality to that as something just to amplify. I think mindfulness practices can help us with that part, and with so much of what we're turning toward, which is about dealing with complex reality. Like, things are sort of simple on the one hand, we are all one, we're all part of one world, et cetera. But then this other complex reality, and yet we're having very separate, right? We're not separate selves, but we actually do have a separate kind of body and agency.
Right.
So having that multiple complex, it's both and, which by itself is countercultural thinking. This is an invitation for us to kind of expand how it is we know and how it is we act from what we know. And definitely you certainly are hearing that loving, grace-filled envelope for it all, because change is always challenging. And while we are safer than we realize in a certain sense, like I'm where I am, you are where we are, we're in any way privileged if we can sit in conversation like this today and not have to be doing something else. And many of us who are in this conversation, whether listening or watching, we are safe enough. And yet, whenever this conversation comes up, all of the threat sensors become enlivened. Is there enough for me? Am I going to be respected? Does somebody want to replace me? On and on and on. So if we can bring these practices in to help us with the predictable reactivity and, cognitive dissonance and all the different ways we might get fidgety, we can bring that loving grace in. That I think it's really essential. It's really essential to this work.
Yes. And so I'll comment on that, and then we can kind of dive into talking about some race stuff. So for the awareness piece, for me, on the one level, it's just, as I'm walking, living, existing, I have that awareness to start seeing some of these things that you talk about in the book, so, and I think the cognitive dissonance comes in. I think, we'll talk a little bit about white privilege and and all those kind of pieces, as you start to see those kind of things, and if you haven't been exposed to it, there is a sense of like, what do you mean by that? Or like, wait, and like you're starting to kind of piece that together. And then the awareness takes in, okay, then there's the mental check. So once I start to see those things, now I'm actually engaged in a situation in reality. And now can my mindfulness kick in a way that, maybe I'm starting to see I have a certain bias, or I've always looked at it through this lens. And now I'm trying to change the lenses, but you have to be mindful about changing that lens, and then mindful about the way in which you engage that situation and the people in that situation, because we've done it in the same way for so long, and we think it's okay, but yet now you're starting to hear that, well, that's really not okay to do it that way. And then I think the third thing that I'm hearing, and your book touches on this, but it's just an outcome of the reality, right? I mean, the reason that race matters, right, and the power dynamics that you're talking about is because that privilege provides access to not just power, but control, energy, money, position, real estate, jobs, everything.
Protection from vulnerability, healthcare, like just a whole lot of stuff.
Everything in our country and beyond probably, has been doled out or withheld based on a lot of those color lines that we talk about. And so, and that's really the other step is, once we start to have some of these conversations, and I guess the belief is if people are willing to engage in the inner work, and then that mindfulness will begin to spill over until, so we talk about beliefs and thoughts, emotions and actions. If we can do the internal work to rethink our beliefs, and that changes our thought patterns and then our emotional connections, then the way in which we act out in the world will be changed as well, because we're being mindful about wanting the value alignment that you were talking about. And then the real catch comes though, because, and I have this down in there, we don't have to jump into it right now, but like when I think of the January 6th, breaking at the Capitol, to me, that was a pushback by a group of individuals who felt really threatened by the very things that we are talking about. Because they feel power and control slipping through their fingers, and they're not going to go down quietly. And the only response that they know, and I'm stereotyping terribly, and I know that, I'm just saying in a sense, so is kind of a power and force response. And that's where they get. And so the rub's going to be, with all the inner work we're doing, at some point though, when are people going to let go of power, control, and work toward a more equal distribution of assets in those realities? And I don't have an answer for that, but I know that down the road, that's ultimately where we're going. If we can change individual thoughts and behaviors toward people on a one-on-one level, on a community and systemic level, who's going to go back in and rewrite the Constitution? Who's going to rewrite all those laws, the housing district red line laws, particularly like after World War II. And like, I don't know, and I've got it in there, like in COVID, I did a deep dive into Indigenous history of America, and the Natives peoples after, and it's brutal. Anyway, and so there's just so much to deal with. So I'm on all board with you on that. So we're going to kind of do that. So let's keep going, I guess. All right.
Let's keep going. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. There is a lot here, and I hear you really just pointing to so many of the different ways that what we're raising is something you're already, you're unpacking, and you've been, sort of bringing your mindfulness right in, or bringing these practices right in to help you with the challenge of like seeing all of this and seeing the implications of it. They're potentially really quite, we start right where we are. And with that subtle, like, what's happening to me, thoughts, emotions, sensations, and what the world will look like from the place of wherever we might arrive as we do this work. Actually, we really don't know. But there is this invitation to kind of look at how a lot of our fears about, there not being enough, our fears about, that are embedded in the capitalist kind of socioeconomic, political economy that we have inherited, where there isn't a lot of safety net for people. And, whether there have been some historical privileges around race and gender or whatever, as you point out, many people can feel like, well, wait a minute, some of these are slipping away in a time where there's climate distress, there's migration, there are all of, reminders of our vulnerability. So in a certain sense, it's completely predictable that there can be this kind of fearful, threat response that then can be manipulated. We all know that right now we're going through a period where we're feeling a little bit uncertain and we're feeling a little more vulnerable than any of us necessarily wants. Again, if any of us are drawn to the sort of social dominance characteristics that run through humankind, the social psychologists tell us that there are, some of us are just kind of drawn toward dominator ways of being in the world. And some of us are more moved by more egalitarian, more humanity conscious ways of being in the world. So these are basic kind of social psychological orientations. And then we're in social structures where, people who might want to amass power can see, oh, people are feeling afraid. Let me, goose that up a little bit. And then you got people just, being supported in ruminating on the things that are making us a little afraid, and really kind of deepening this, deepening the sense of anxiety and concern, as opposed to helping us find ways to meet those fears and concerns as bridges to creating a world that works for more of us and more of us and more of us, which it could do.
It could.
But again, yeah, you're right. There is a lot here, but what I find hopeful is what I've seen in my own life and what I continue to see being borne out as the research more and more catches up to what good people across the globe have been trying to offer for generations, in the way of support for navigating change, in the way of support for becoming more emotionally and socially intelligent, in the way of recognizing when we have enough and not getting caught up in somebody else's fantasies of what success needs to look like in terms of being able to amass constantly, more and more and more and more. So there's a deep invitation at the core of this to deepen starting with ourselves, our personal, and then our interpersonal, and then the kind of in the collectives that we're in, our skillfulness in navigating the waters and rivers of this time. And we can do it. There's a lot of research that says we can.
Okay. We can do it, but you got to roll your sleeves up and be willing to wade in there. So, okay. Then let's see. I want to do. Let's jump in then, and just we kind of hit on a few of these things. We don't have to go overdo it, but I do think there's some concepts around race, that are just would be really good to. And I could summarize a couple, and then I'll let you jump into a couple things. So, one of the quotes that you had in there, and I'm going to totally not do the name right. Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyway, and I didn't put the whole thing in, but the one about. So just as a start off, because I thought this really, because like it made me, I had to, okay. Because like my first thought was it'd be the other way around. But then the more I thought about it as I was reading the book, it really made a lot of sense. So is that a he or a she? I'm sorry, I don't know.
It's a he.
Okay.
And he wrote a book called Between the World and Me, which is a beautiful book. He kind of wrote it as if he were writing a letter to his young son, a Black man writing a letter to his son about how this thing called racism arises between whoever we are and the world. And so one of the observations that he writes about and trying to kind of prepare his son for this thing coming up that might get in the way of you being just who you were born to be. This thing called, racism against the Black male, right? The anti-Black male racism, which is its own thing.
It's his own thing.
Yeah. So he's trying to kind of prepare his beautiful son, as any one of us might. If we find ourselves in a situation where something is going to come after our beloved, we want to give him a little bit of preparation for. This book kind of emerged. And so this quote that you're presenting comes out of that.
Well, that's beautiful. So I didn't do the whole thing, but just that race is the child of racism and not the father. I'll say that. So race is the child of racism and not the father. And so, and so my interpretation for me is that, so racism existed. And in order to effectuate more permanently, the privilege that was bestowed and was desired through racism, then this social construct of race was created and then interlaced throughout our systems in a way to perfect this notion of racism in order to protect those who would have the privilege against those who would not. And so I thought that was kind of, because in your head, it kind of seems like it would go the other way, that there were the differences and then racism rose out of that. But that would be kind of this sense of some kind of natural evolution and the family disintegrating and all that. And that really wasn't it. It was that there was power and control here and they wanted to maintain it and strengthen it. And so it kind of went the other way. So
exactly. If you just look at that history around the world, Enlightenment period and before, right? So 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, right? We're getting these early versions of global trade and colonialism and encounters, right? The world population that is, since time immemorial been, diverse and not as integrated. We've got pockets of folks all around the globe, but a humankind that is evolved. The early ancestral evidence seems to indicate from Africa, although again, there is sort of different places where we see expansion of evolutionary activity at different times, but the earliest evidence from the continent of Africa, and then over millennia, like over time that we can't even process, moving around the globe. Certainly something happened in, the 1400s, 1600s, when efforts to expand beyond Europe, expand beyond Portugal, expand beyond, right, all of these different places where power had amassed and was seeking to sustain itself by extracting resources, by, finding different ways to continue to increase wealth, bringing together cultures. Cultures were coming together, bringing those cultures together. And what had been just people who were different and had different life ways. There's a lot of evidence that there were always travelers coming through who were different. This tale of the Good Samaritan in the Bible. There were all these different ways that people were, and we knew the stranger. But to then kind of create a narrative and a story of like, well, these entire people, let's just categorize the world in terms of maybe 5 giant groups of categories of people. And then embed in those ideas certain characteristics, values of what essentially it means to be white or Black or Asian or, now we say Latinx, indigenous, et cetera, et cetera. The idea that you can divide humankind into these, very broad categories, that was emerging suspiciously, contemporaneously with the effort to solidify these sort of mass systems of, to justify colonial expansion, imperialism, ultimately enslavement and slavery. Again, all of the genocidal land clearings. So, there are many different ways that the efforts to justify those practices evolved. They had to do with religious differences, cultural differences, but the ready availability of differences in skin type and phenotype, right? The shape of the nose, the shape of the eyes, just such a ready kind of marker of something that we could then fill in the blank with all kinds of content to justify these systems that were already emerging of exploitation and appropriation. And again, these systems were emerging even in relatively what we now would think of as monoracial settings, so that within Europe, the Jewish idea of an identity of, a sort of a Jewish other or a gypsy other, right? So we do this. We can do this even in what we now think of as relatively monoracial settings. Again, finding something about some characteristics of this group that we can then use as a justification to, normalize and naturalize. I appreciate you pointing that out as the alternative. The naturalize, like we're trying to naturalize, make it seem like it's a natural occurrence, and it naturally makes sense that there are these hierarchies and that there are these sort of, justifications for the things we want to do to amass power and wealth. But that is what he was pointing to, the way that these ideologies of race followed on the imperative of justifying land grabs, resource grabs, bringing people in to work for other people. We had to, if you look at the history. So this is a sentence that's really drawing from.
Right.
It's a history to look at. And this is where the debate over, should we look at the history, this debate that people are talking about around quote unquote critical race theory. All I can say about that is, the invitation really is to just inquire, do we want to know our history, and do we want to think well about the contemporary implications of it? And each of us has a choice to make about that. But it seems to me educated people, as has been said by many wiser people than I, right? Those who ignore our history, we're condemned to repeat it. But if we want to be wise in relationship to what's happening, aren't we in some sense well served by at least being open to learning what the historical record might teach us? And if you look at it, you see a lot of evidence for what I'm sharing here.
Well, that's our history. I mean,
If
you look at that, that's what it's going to teach you. Yeah. So, and I know in my background, I've got a master's of divinity too, and spent a lot of time within the context of the church. And so the church's history within that context in the name of salvation, and that is also a pretty tainted story as well. And so there's a lot of restoration that needs to go around those, because capitalism, it seems, along with, the church vision of the future, kind of went hand in hand with a lot of these kind of practices. So,
yes.
Well, let's not to get too. So we talked a little bit about race being a social construct. It was created in order to kind of embody and systemically enforce racism. What you were talking about, I have down is maybe that's your definition of racialized individuals and or bodies. And so then we started to identify bodies that look different, and we could categorize those bodies by certain traits, including skin color, facial pieces, all that kind of stuff. And so that was
very
the racial.
rough. It's so rough though, right?
Yeah.
People like me, for example, in this context in the US, Black woman. But, I've had people come up to me and go, are you Indonesian?
Yeah.
Or, when I've traveled to South Africa, we know there are a lot of people in America who think they're Black who are not. Like I'm one of those people. Yeah. So, it's done differently in around places around the world, but yet we learn what the logic of it is, what the rules of it are, where we are, and we just start applying it. So without question, that's a Black woman, right? So it is part of what we're in this deep way.
Yeah, and that's not even to mention then the different levels of colorization within that, right? And so lighter skin versus super dark skinned, and where that fits in. And yeah, I know. And I think in the book, you mentioned 2 or 3 stories of people that came from somewhere else and they weren't considered Black enough, or however it was described. And then yet they come here and they are, and it's just like very different in which the way.
Exactly. Rihanna has told.
Right. Yeah. That was the one. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
She has told that story. Bruno Mars has a story, right?
Yeah.
These figures, these pop figures who have international stardom, wherever they enter into this discourse around race in the US in particular ways that give us, again, insight into everything we're talking about.
Right.
Rihanna, born in a context in the Caribbean where race wasn't a feature. They were all kind of a culture and place. And then come to, and in fact, there was colorism in the sense that she was often considered to be lighter than a lot of the people around her. And then coming into the United States, very clearly just a Black American where it's a very different set of rules. Bruno Mars, multiracial background, but with a last name that sounds Latinx.
Yeah.
Originally, his original last name, Hernandez, I believe.
Right.
entering into the music scene, everyone wanted him to be a Latin singer. And why aren't you singing, in Spanish? And he's like, because that's not who I am. So he literally chose a name. The Mars name, he says, was meant to sort of suggest I'm out of this world. Like, don't put me in all these boxes. And then we're encountering him around the world, right? In a way that we couldn't have if the imperatives of racial ordering of the music industry had its way. It would have had him somewhere singing in a Latinx context because his name sounded Latin, or Latino. So again, these ideas shape a lot, and then yet even these stories speak of the way that people have been resisting the effort to be constrained by the ideologies and the systems and structures. And I just want to name that these stories we're talking about are absolutely contemporary, which is, again, a reminder. We're not talking about, we can touch into what happened with the Catholics and the slave trade as if this all, really did gear up and had a certain kind of energy after, the period of the 1600s, 1700s, enslavement, Civil War. But right now, still ongoing. And that's the hard part. And that's really the invitation of this work for us.
Okay. All right. Well, then let me just throw a couple terms out there. And I don't want to get too caught because I do want to get to mindfulness and all that. And I'm conscious that we're already kind of rolling here, so I don't want to take too much. But anyway, so we talked about race a little bit, racialized bodies, racism as it relates to that. We'll come back to systemic racism as we get going. I guess where was I going? I kind of want to just jump into, because some of the terms you have in are racial literacy, racial justice. Obviously, there's a term for that. Mindful racial justice, emotional intelligence, race as an illusion. I wrote down, you had race making, because it's kind of created and it's ongoing and evolutionary as things change and move. Then you had the big lie, which is kind of part of that. And then under white supremacy and white privilege, there's the white privilege bargain, which I talked a little bit about. I think the point, though, and this really was hit home to me when I was in law school, kind of repeatedly, was that the notion of the foundation of the formation of the United States by our forefathers, whatever you want to, that it was, in fact, really a lot of it was structured in order to support the role of white privilege and white supremacy in the way in which they interpreted it at that time. And so it was really embedded in the very foundation of our country, in our original documents, in our structures, and all of those kind of things. And so those kind of pieces are all there. And let's see, you have
and by the way, that's a really hard part.
That's a really hard. Yeah, people see. So when you talk about cognitive dissonance, and then you start talking about that, and then you start kind of pulling out some of these examples and all those kind of pieces, I think it's really, really painful. I mean, if you had that conversation with, I won't name the category of folks that I know, but I mean, I've been in those circles, and they would absolutely reject that and could not go there at all, which to me is kind of hand in hand with the rejection of the critical race theory pieces that, I mean, like, I'm off season in Tennessee, and they passed one, you can't teach, and it specifically names pieces that you cannot teach because, and the justification was that it is too traumatic for white kids to have to go through that educational process. So, I mean, Tennessee is what it is. You know what I mean? But I mean, it's really difficult when you're just going to lop off a whole chunk of history and not be able to include it. And so, but that piece, I think, for a lot of people is really difficult. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about kind of white privilege, white supremacy, and this kind of origination of our fathers. I did highlight a quote that you had in there. I was going to read a little bit. We don't have to, but just about the whole colonial era and the development of our country and the use of laws, politics, religious symbols, even our architecture, in the way it was structured. And I thought you did a great job with that too, about just bringing awareness to kind of white spaces, that kind of the dominant culture has its own way of doing things and structuring things and doing that. And if you're within that dominant culture, you feel really comfortable in that space. But if you're not, and then you enter into that space, it's really uncomfortable and can be disconcerting in that way. And then it's particularly important, I think, if we're talking about having conversations with people in safe ways, paying attention to that kind of space. So anyway, that's a whole bunch. So if you want, you can kind of just go a little bit on that. And then I have one of the quotes from you personally, a couple pages. We don't have to do that. I also want you just to talk about the cost of racism, because I think some, in my world, I have numerous friends, particularly in athletics, from coaching and playing, and that with people of color from all kinds of different backgrounds and all that kind of stuff. And feel fortunate enough that we've been able to know each other well enough that I've heard those stories. I've seen things transpire, both with players and fellow coaches, those kind of things that have been really difficult and all that. But, I guess I just, I'm putting out there, like, the more I listen to those stories, the more that it's really difficult for me to even kind of comprehend the cost of it. I spent 25 years doing criminal defense work. And even though I was in Iowa, 40% of my client base were people of color. And so, I experienced pretty close hand a lot of the things that they dealt with, from police stops to the way they were treated, the arrests that were made, the charges that were there, how the judges treated us, all that kind of stuff. So, but I didn't get up every day and put my feet on the ground and go to that job that was limited because of whatever, and or the educational opportunity, all that kind of stuff. So, all right, and that's a huge softball of stuff. I'll let you just kind of go wherever your heart takes you, because it'll be great. But I, touch on any of those kind of pieces that you'd like to, then please.
Wow. Well, I'm just thinking, when you described your experience in doing the criminal justice work that you've been doing, seeing what you saw, and then again, that's been part of what's unfurling for you, what's unfolding for you about the difference that these differences have made, the difference that race has made. And it's one thing to try to open up cognitive space to understand it. Again, given we've lived all very different lives and our experiences are very different. And given a culture that's giving us ready explanation for the differences that we see that are not about anybody's fault, except maybe the victims. It's maybe it's the fault of the people themselves. So I appreciate you speaking to your own kind of efforts to kind of make sense of this, and recognizing that it's even as much as you've been able to kind of see more, there is still that gap of experience. Like, what is it like? And recognize, again, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a book, Between the World and Me, trying to give his son a sense of what this might be about, which in and of itself suggests there's a gulf there that is real and is difficult for us to really get. And yet we must do these things to try, I think, if we're ever really going to disrupt the patterns. And I also want to just name that I'm in contact with researchers and have studied some of the research that confirms, again, that simply wanting to understand these things, and also hearing data such as is implicit in what you're describing about and explicit, the disproportionality of Black folks in engagement with the criminal justice system, for example. I think for a very long time, especially liberals, believe that if you just knew the data on that, then you would realize that something is wrong and you would be inspired to enact some sort of restorative, reparative justice reforms. But research has been coming out to confirm that actually is not so for many, many people. Many people, when they hear the data on the disparities, whatever they may explicitly say about support for justice, will have been shown to a statistically significant degree to later actually support more conservative approaches, more tough on crime approaches. In other words, there is a kind of slightly unexpected on some version, but I've seen enough of this data that I'm not shocked, but that difference between our stated values and what we actually would support in terms of policies and reforms there's often a gap, and certainly a gap that shows up when that is enhanced, actually, a gap in the direction of stricter criminalization penalties, for example, that shows up when you show and talk about the disparities in terms of racial contact with policing. Jennifer Eberhardt, the Stanford educated psychologist, has done this kind of implicit bias research. She wrote a book recently called Biased, in which she lays out some of this evidence. Like, in other words, we can't just simply tell people about the statistical differences and expect that they'll be more sympathetic to the plight of Black men. That's not how it works, it turns out. So we have to actually really work to try and disrupt what is that temptation created by our social cultural structures to just go with the flow of bias. In other words, they call it hegemony. When the biased system is just chugging along. One of my colleagues in sociology wrote a book called Racism Without Racists. It's like, we don't need to be committed to racism. All we need to do is not interrupt when we see these systems or gently support putting people in power by a vote here or there, or not failing to vote here or there, that will enact more, kind of criminalizing, racializing policies that reinforce the idea that there's a racial difference. Because look in the world, look, there's more of them in prison. So that's one of the ways that we see that race being a child of these racist policing structures or racist policies that end up over incarcerating people of color. Then we start to, see, oh, there's something to this idea of a racial difference, because look, they're all in custody. It's like, so it's really, it's really hard for us as we try and do this work, because oppression works. Like, the history is working on us all the time. And it's, because it's showing us I live in a community right now where, my partner originally immigrated, his family immigrated from India. He is, born and raised and is an American citizen. And because he came along when we did during the civil rights era, where we have these opportunities that were literally and completely systematically cut off from people like us just a couple of generations ago. So he has bought this house, him and the bank have this house. But if you look at the deeds that covered all of these houses at the time that they were built in the early to mid 1900s in San Francisco, California, they include these racially restrictive covenants saying that the homes couldn't be sold to people that look like us. And so when Willie Mays tried to move into this neighborhood, not far from here, he ran into, a lot of difficulty. Ultimately, he had the money and could buy a home, but only lived there little more than a year because of the great unfriendliness and the great subtle messaging. You don't belong. We don't want you here. Willie Mays. So I'm saying all that to say that we live in, so when I walk through this neighborhood now, it's not changed very much. There's still very few people who look like me in this part of San Francisco. And so we have these, and in San Francisco in general, we could talk, has some history around all of this. I've just pointed toward a little of it. A lot of history embedded in maintaining white spaces, maintaining the idea that part of what it means to be successful is to live amongst other white people and not see people who are different. There is a subtle training around that is even true and around us in these famously liberal and progressive cities. So there is a lot for us to do. And then the question of, how are we subtly colluding with these things? And yeah.
Well, there was one piece as we were doing the criminal justice piece, because there's certainly sentencing provisions and arrests and those kind of things that, tie into kind of a racist approach and are more punitive to that. When you mentioned though that, you kind of have the liberal, like, we want this to all be better, and yet people vote to enforce more strict criminalization. Here's what I experienced, and then I just wanted to ask if this, Matt, that reality be so Midwest, right? That's my upbringing, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. That's where I did a lot of my formative years and work. And there's this real strong notion of independence and individual accountability. And so we are accountable no matter what our situation in life to pull ourselves up, even if we don't have boots or straps, but there's that mental theory. And so you were talking about hidden values. And so one of the hidden values that I keep coming up against in the criminal justice system was this notion of individual accountability. And so on the one hand, you'd have a very deep, empathetic kind of view of, impact of racism and discrimination and loss of housing opportunity and loss of employment opportunities and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we need to work on that. And it was all kind of feel good and blah, blah, blah. But then on the criminal end, you either did or did not burglarize a house. And if you burglarized the house, then that's an accountability meant, well, sorry.
Right.
Or if you sold drugs, then that whole piece in there. And there was this really deep disconnect. And, and I guess what I was really going to ask about, so one of the things that the last 2 years during COVID, I'm Mr. Zoom like everybody else, right? And so I took a lot, particularly finishing a life coaching certification and doing a lot of other stuff. But I took a series on the psychological impact of racism, and particularly on Black men, because that's the population I've spent so much time working with, and kind of the emotional trauma, the psychological trauma, and then the physical manifestations of living in a racist society and being treated in that kind of way. And I guess, where it kind of moved me toward the piece was like, I think in my younger years, if I had received the same kind of treatment and had all those kind of doors shut in my face, I don't know what I'd have done. You know what I mean? I was never tested in that kind of way because, I got invited to the right places, had the right doors open, got my law degree. And so then, I'm amazing and all that kind of stuff, right? So, I guess that disconnect there. And so that was always the rub though, when I talk to people, well, yeah, but, there wouldn't be that number of people in the system if that number of people weren't committing crimes. And so the disconnect between the systemic version of racism and its implications for the day-to-day lives of people and the emotional and psychological impact that would have on people, and then this reality over here. And there wasn't a willingness to change this response because, well, no, we do that for everybody. That part's fair. You know what I'm saying? Because
totally.
If you're white or Black and you burglarize somebody's house and you get caught, it's the same 25-year prison term.
Right.
And that's where,
so we have been told.
Or so we've been told. That's true, because you still have to go through sentencing and there's plea bargaining and.
Well, for example, we have evidence right now of different types of crimes that have been committed, alleged. We saw in our own eyes.
I saw them.
We have seen crimes committed that are not necessarily being prosecuted.
Right.
So there is not, so that just that idea that we have as a baseline that, well, if you do this thing, you do that, you get this, is actually not true. There is a disproportionate effort and arrayment of resources to police, right? An administrative policing state that's focused on certain types of people.
There's no doubt.
Right? So, that's the part that we're talking about. So yes, if you focus the resources on certain type of people, you will bring in more people. And
you're going to, right. If the funnel is there, right. And honestly, I've preempted charges. Like I've on a Sunday morning after a terrible Saturday night for somebody been able to make phone calls that now we got people out of jail that avoided, we made other arrangements and there weren't even criminal charges filed. That's because, that's all we did is our volume of criminal defense work. We did a ton of it and we knew every single prosecutor,
yes.
You know what I mean? And so, and a lot of people don't have those, and that's not a cheap asset to locate for a lot of people. You know what I mean? So, and a lot of people couldn't afford to have us do that for them.
Yeah. So that's their intersectionality between race and class, the sedimentation of poverty disproportionately among Black and Brown and Indigenous people in our communities. It doesn't mean there aren't white impoverished people who are also ensnared in these criminal injustice, kind of dynamics. There are. So it's the both and. It's both that this is, but there very definitely is this way that impoverishment is disproportionately a reality for people of color. And then when you see the criminal justice system, again, kind of running on law over here for the privileged, economically and racially privileged, and another kind of law for those who are not. I mean, those are aspects of the system that kind of disrupt the story that we would like to tell, that, well, if you do this thing, I understand there's racism, but if you do this thing, then you have to, and then the system is some kind of way fair. Again, if you're willing to understand and see the many ways that the system is rigged actually against certain people. And that is, again, it's a hard thing to accept. I've had to listen, I've sat and listened to white racialized prosecutors and public defenders who have come to my law school and other schools and have told us again and again and again of the factual basis for what I'm describing. It's a kind of an open secret and shame that our criminal justice system is so racially skewed and economically skewed. And then the intersectionality of that is so real and pervasive in our communities. But it is, so it's, so whenever we have these conversations about personal accountability, it really is an invitation to kind of look again at what we think we know so well about these systems that we're, on some level we understand and we want to uphold as the best we can do. But if we're not willing to really look critically at what these systems are doing, then we can be very well complicit in injustice, very complicit.
Okay, so we can just finish this whole thing, but here's what I want you to define intersectionality. And so I found a great podcast on that. I can't remember the woman's name, but she does this. It's amazing. So they have some really stuff on there, and they've been doing a series on critical race theory and intersectionality. It's been really powerful. But say a word about intersectionality and then maybe the cost of racism. But we should say a little something on mindfulness in a little bit more detail for maybe listeners, because that's the whole point of this. So we're getting well, this is great, though. I thank you for that. So maybe define that, but let's jump into mindfulness and then just help people understand what your understanding of that. And because we kind of talked about it, but then let's get into that just a little bit more before because I know we only got like 15 minutes. Maybe if you're okay with that, we'll try to do that. Okay.
Well, maybe we should start with me offering this definition of mindfulness, and then we can talk about intersectionality and kind of unpack these intersections a bit more. I think of mindfulness in some of the ways that are familiar with those who have experienced or explored mindfulness in, well-being training, psychological trainings, maybe in more and more you're seeing it offered in athletic and other places where we're trying to see the role of mindfulness for focusing, right, for managing our anxieties, right, performance anxieties and so on. So mindfulness then comes out as specific kinds of practices for paying attention and noticing, in a particular kind of way, right, what's happening. So when I say in a particular way, I mean with a certain openness, and I often say as best we can, non-judgmental attitude. We're trying not to judge what's coming up. Although, of course, we're human and we will judge, especially if we went into law. In any degree, we are judgers. But we're trying as best we can to just notice. And yes, to notice with this open, non-judgmental awareness. And mindfulness then can be seen as the kinds of practices that support us in opening up to what is here to see and to engage with. Right. And so in my book, I talk about grounding in certain types of practices. So awareness of body and breath, movement practices, interpersonal mindfulness practices, where we're noticing a temptation to kind of stop listening to a certain person or be distracted rather than being focused in a conversation or to already have our response that we're preparing before we even listen to the other person. So we can bring that awareness, the willingness to be present, to pay attention with openness to any object. But we start often with practices that train us in bringing our awareness to an object by sitting meditation. It's one kind of very regularly available. And we say sitting meditation, it really means being in the body and paying attention perhaps to the sensations of breathing, awareness of breath in the body practice. So noticing the in-breath and the out-breath and resting our attention on those sensations. Doing that can help us with building up that muscle for placing our attention where we would like at will, bringing back the wandering mind, because any one of us who will do that. Let's say we pause right now. We want to bring awareness to the sensations of breathing in and out. Gentle awareness. We're not seizing too tightly on it, right? And if focusing on the breath creates any anxiety at all, just drop this practice and don't do it, right? Because it's all meant to be a support here, not to try and enforce something that, that doesn't feel like something you would be willing to explore. Always, we're all our own best friend, our own best judge about what kind of practice we want to do. But if we're willing to just look at, like, what happens when we are invited to rest our attention on the sensations of breathing? For many of us, right away, we start thinking about other stuff. Right away, we get fidgety in the body. And then mindfulness is meant, therefore, not to tell you you don't know how to do this or you're no good at this, but to say, oh, look, notice how hard it is, even when you give yourself permission to rest, even when you give yourself permission to just sit and be gently present to what it feels like to just breathe and sit. Wow, it's not easy for us to do that. And so it's really an invitation to get to know the mind and all of its sort of little guises, the ways it skitters and goes to and fro, and the way we get attached to different stories or thoughts that we don't want to let go of. And then notice the ability that if we are willing to let go, we can. So awareness of breath and body is just a practice for helping build the muscle of, well, on one level, focusing attention where you choose. Oh, I want to focus in on my breath. What happens? Oops, I can't. Let me practice. Bring that muscle back with kindness and bringing the muscle of awareness back to the sensations of breathing in and breathing out with love and compassion each time, not beating ourselves up. So that's a whole practice for being with yourself and, learning about how you are. And that's just one of many ways to then become more aware of our hidden, often subtle habits, patterns, conditions, and also just to deepen our compassion and love for ourselves. Because again, you're coming back each moment with the sort of loving embrace of like, this is who you are. You're tired. I got the monkey mind going. Like the mind is, in meditation, we sometimes use the phrase monkey mind, this idea that, like a monkey, we're just grabbing different this and that and cannot stay focused on any one thing. Bringing attention back gently with love each time is the invitation of the practice. And that kind of skillfulness can help us with looking at difficult aspects of our experience, like looking at race. And because we want to move away. I had a young man say, I tell myself I don't know anything about race. It's a white racialized man. And he said, actually, what I realize is I intentionally turn away. Very different from I don't know. And to be able to name, it's not that I don't know, I haven't seen it. Oh, this is me intentionally turning away every time it comes up. That's a huge, right? Putting up the platter and then saying, I have no idea. I've never seen that.
Yeah, I don't see it. What are you talking about? What?
Right, exactly.
Right.
But that is a habit. And that is an adaptation to stressful realities, right? It's conditioning. It's a number of things. But knowing that we do that is important, and mindfulness can help us with that. And so we can see that in those practices and body practices of walking, meditation, movement, interpersonal communication, listening and speaking. And so when we look at different aspects of reality through the lens of mindfulness, we can see things like, oh, it matters perhaps in my social world. I might be met in the world differently because of the way I'm embodied as not just a cisgender female woman, but a woman with this particular set of phenotype, characteristics, right? So this particular skin coloration and hair and nose and height and maybe class, right? Because intersect that, age, assumptions people make. In other words, intersectionality then is something that we can understand a little bit more robustly through the practices of mindfulness. So intellectually speaking, it's just this idea that as we move through the world, our experiences are, a complex of information that is being funneled in ways that reference and reveal assumptions people make about us based on these social categories that are out there in the world. So people have assumptions about women of all colors and backgrounds, but they have some specific assumptions about, let's say, Black women. So if I move through the world and someone encounters me, they don't know me. They're just looking at me. Goodness knows, God forbid, if I have on some sweats, right, as opposed to a shirt and a jacket and all of these fancy things that I've learned to sometimes wear, even if I don't necessarily want to try to disrupt the many assumptions people make if I just choose to go out in a t-shirt or go out in a leather jacket, as my father-in-law one time scolded me for doing at an airport. You don't travel looking like that. A Black man who was saying, we can't travel wearing the kinds of casual clothes that other people do because we will be treated differently. So intersectionality then is a window into how it is that the intersecting identities of race and gender, or race, gender, and class, race, gender, class, and age, can result in a complex of experiences that can mean my experience as a Black woman may be very different from the experiences of a Black man. My experiences as a Black woman may be very different from the experiences of a white woman. So we need this kind of more complex ability to, again, be present to. So grounding in the practices then can help us to see more of that robust differentiatedness that is the social world, to expand the capacity to be with the complexity, right? It's not going to fit on a bumper sticker. It's not long for the short tweet, the short pithy. This is, again, disrupting the normal ways we go through the world, where we're constantly putting ourselves and each other in these boxes. And it's inviting some kind of inquiry, looking within, looking at our own experience. So looking at what it means to be racialized as white and be in a male identified and identifying body, white male experience. How is that different from the experience of a man in a differently racialized body, or the experience again of a white body, different gender? And then opening up to seeing how those categories, again, key into these sort of dynamics around othering and belonging, or hierarchy, value, such that certain combinations of characteristics do often lead to certain kinds of experiences. Just as one example, there's recent research out that indicates 5,000 large population of folks surveyed, trying to get a sense of the ways we handle unpredictable outcomes and the different ways that maybe there's something to our social identities, our demographics, that can help us understand the different ways we might respond to something we didn't expect. And it turns out this recent study indicates that people who are at the intersection of whiteness and maleness, white men, react with greater difficulty to the unexpected happening. Partly because there's been such a long history, perhaps, of being in control, knowing in advance what's going to happen, being okay, that when things start to happen like coronavirus, or everyone said that this person was going to win the election and then this person won the election, the resistance to the facts is a little different than women, people of color. We're a little more used to things happening that we didn't expect or predict, having to roll with it. not having to disrupt everything because something happened. So again, this is a body of, well-researched, well-regarded, using all of the standard scientific method principles that's recently trying to help us understand what we're living with right now and seeing in a way that I think can make some sense if we think about it. If you are traditionally, again, protected from vulnerability, then to all of a sudden be in a time of interlocking pandemics where everything seems to be changing all the time, having the wherewithal to just say, you know what, we're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. We do not have to storm any place or change we're going to get through this. Right. But it's, again, so in other words, I'm just naming that as one, again, indication that our intersectional experience actually does impact our processing of data in the world, our way of being around reality. And so mindfulness can help us at least create some breathing room, see what might be happening in our own, temptation to resist these outcomes that we didn't expect, or tendency to resist the idea that we might need to open up more space for, women or trans folks, or whatever might be the latest call for inclusion that we might be resisting, that any one of us, whatever our background. I will say, as a Black woman, I've had to notice that I wasn't trained to predict or expect the opening up of sex orientation, rights, and the conversation about gender expression. I grew up in Southern North Carolina, and it was a very kind of different sort of set of trainings around gender that I received. So I know what it's like to be invited, to think differently. Wait a minute. People are saying there is something called cisgender versus transgender. And I know from my own need to notice my reactivity, notice do I have to think about changing my language a little bit? I know that can happen for any one of us, that we can be a little bit in resistance, having cognitive dissonance around that. And I also know what it's like to then say, but if somebody else has been suffering and I can do something, at low cost, really, right, to just alleviate it by changing the way I use language, or minimizing the predictions, right? The assumptions I make about how somebody else is going to use language. I can do that in the service of creating more freedom and opportunity for people. And all of a sudden, by the way, it turns out there are people that I didn't know, right, who would benefit from that, who are in my family, in my community, I didn't know, were hoping that some kind of opening would happen so that they could feel more free. So I hope that was a long way of touching on a lot of different aspects.
That was good. So here's, I was just going to comment. So like the other part of our program that we do, so we're part of Thunderbird Performance. That's what we do the podcast out of. So I do something called mindful awareness and performance. So I do mental prep coaching with athletes. Mm-hmm. And so everything's mindfulness and meditation based. That's our foundation for everything. But it's a really interesting transition because almost none of the athletes I work with have any exposure to mindfulness or meditation. And so, but what you were talking about, though, developing the muscle and awareness. And so we use it, in kind of, identifying purpose, setting vision and goals, process, action steps, and being present in the moment. And then we deal with it in situations like in a game, if something doesn't go right, how to recenter, do all that kind of stuff. But you're right, it totally changes people, so the daily practice is so critical because it does prepare them, because you can't access mindfulness unless you're working on it all the time. It's not a tool that you just pull out of the trunk of the car.
Switch on. Exactly.
It doesn't work that way at all, because it is such a trained experience. And it's actually like the deeper you go into it, I don't want to say failings, but, I kind of miss my step occasionally because, I know about mindfulness. I get in a situation with a real difficult person and it slips through my fingers at times. It's not perfect. Yes. And so we kind of keep working on that. Yeah. So, but anyway, I just want to comment on that. And then I guess maybe because we probably should kind of work toward closing. I'd love to do another segment if you want to at some point. But the one thing about all of your meditations that I found to be a little bit different was that you were so grounded in the body. And so almost every one of the guided meditations, kind of entered into that meditative process. But then there was a really nice specific way in which identifying the body and then the groundedness to the earth in your chair, whatever that was, and then the body scan type stuff to identify maybe potential body manifestations of race talk. So as I identify as a white racialized male, and I'm hearing stories from brothers and sisters who have experienced racism, whether I was implicitly involved or not, how does that show up in my body? And so I guess I wanted to just, in your role as that, because I think that's a unique, because that's not always the process. And I had in here, and that's a whole other conversation. So I'm kind of a big proponent. I don't know if you're familiar with IFS therapy, internal family systems. But it's this idea that we all have parts, and those parts manifest themselves physically. And so a lot of the therapeutic process in that dynamic is all identified. Where is that part showing up in your body? And then the manifestation within the body helps you express and understand how that's going to manifest in your life. But maybe you could just say a little bit about the mindfulness approach that you've taken and connecting to the body, because this is my experience. And, if it doesn't connect, but that the trauma related to racism, social injustice, environmental injustice, and those pieces on a day-to-day basis for a population and a group of people, it does have embodied manifestations. And being able to identify those things and then using mindfulness as a way to try to, massage, manage, release, however that might be. So anyway, that's a long-winded question,
Yes.
but I'd love to hear just a little bit more about embodiment of trauma as it relates to racism and using mindfulness as a tool to kind of work through that, because I think that's a very powerful notion.
Oh, thank you so very much. Right. So maybe we could have another talk to get into this a little bit more. But
well, yeah, because I know we're cruising on 2 hours. I think we got about 10 minutes left. It's going to shut us off. So
sure.
We can say whatever
I
you
say
want,
a little bit more.
Okay, so why don't we could wrap with this, and then we can figure something else out, because I'm not even on page 2 of my outline yet, so I'm sorry.
No,
anyway,
it's great. There's so much. Right. So, this invitation to kind of home to the body, keep coming home to the body, is a core, I think, of how I view mindfulness, actually. And I was very heartened that, one of the people who found my book and kind of brought me into his circle is a teacher of early Buddhism, frankly, because again, for me, and this is not the only foundation for these practices, but it is one, who his name is Venerable Analio. And he's a scholar who's looked at the early teachings and sees, when he looks at that, all of the ways that those early teachings were completely about awareness of this full body experience. And so found in my book, like this resonance, like, yes, the way she's presenting mindfulness actually is bringing us back home to like the original teachings, which were always about a whole body experience. And yet in our Western take-up, commercial kind of secular take-up of mindfulness and teaching, which is beautiful, helpful in so many ways, it's been so focused on sort of the mind.
Right.
Mindfulness, when actually, again, those scholars who are proficient in the early languages from which we draw so much of what we call mindfulness will say the symbols, when you look at them in the original languages, or the Pali or Sanskrit, or even in the later evolving Asian heritage languages, the symbols used for mindfulness really could have as easily been interpreted as heartfulness or heart mindfulness, or some symbol that is much more evocative of a whole bodied awareness. Yes, centered in this region as opposed to this region. But of course, in the Western culture, this is the place where we think everything is happening. So part of what we're doing is actually bringing these understandings and teachings back into alignment with what we know from the historical record is where they originated. But I also really, for me, it all, the reason why I've been always so passionate about the way that these practices of awareness can support us in dealing with race and racism is because in my own, humble experience, as a brown-bodied, young woman at the time going into law and academia, having come from higher education and training as a military officer, all these things I did, which people were meeting this body and not expecting, right? So I was getting a lot of feedback about how social identity can be disrupted when we come through different doors than people, come in a different way than was expected, whether it's me representing insurance companies in a courtroom or, shopping for a certain kind of car in a certain neighborhood, a class disruption type of thing, which though I wasn't born with any kind of economic privilege, now having come through the education that I was able to have as a result of the civil rights movement, right? The changes that were happening in law and policy. I have had these opportunities that were literally denied to, prior generations of people who just look like exactly like me from the place that I came from. So I know from that lived experience more than maybe I would have wanted about these social dynamics. And I've had conversations really for more than 20 years, deepening rich conversations with people from all different backgrounds, and been looking at the research as well to help us understand more that, yes, all of these experiences that we have are, they live in our bodies. They live our own experiences, and then also intergenerationally,
Right.
things that are not obvious.
The legacy stuff.
Right. The legacies of this, and this is true for certainly Black-bodied people, brown, indigenous, but it's also true for white, Asian heritage people. It's also true for white-bodied people. We're all carrying intergenerational resonances, messages. If we have been part of a culture of dominance that's had to justify itself and justify itself and justify itself, there's a kind of a way in which the muscle of release, opening up, power with as opposed to power over is not just going to happen and spring forth. So looking at where we are right here, right now, what happens in our bodies as a support for doing this kind of racial justice work, restorative work, healing work, repairing. So we're healing the wounds of the most vulnerable, right? We're trying to provide practices that can support people who are right now on the front lines, being more vulnerable when they are encountered by police, to people using excessive force, because we know there are patterns around that. Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, many times more vulnerable. Any one of us is vulnerable, by the way, because there are lots of guns out there and there's a whole culture of militarized policing that any one of us could fall victim to. And there are these patterns that do tie to the long history of this big lie that certain people were not equally human. And certain people were some kind of way, by definition, less likely even to feel pain. This was embedded in our training for so long. The doctors are trained this. They're still trained this. I have, there's a book called Just Medicine that came out by a law professor, studies medicine, works in healthcare, looking at all the biases in the healthcare system, including the way doctors are still trained that certain people over-exaggerate pain, or certain groups, Latinx people have this response to pain, and Black people, the trainings, racializing trainings that have run through all of our different institutions and disciplines, and therefore are in all of us, are very, very real, and they go very deep. And so having some practices that support us, and not just thinking differently about it, but feeling the impact, including what happens when we're invited to actually think differently about that training, and what happens when we think, oh, someone criticizing this fancy degree that I got and fancy training at this university, haven't I felt good about that degree from that place, right? And where does it go in my body? Do I want to just disconnect from my body? Do I just want to shut it off? Am I getting anxious? Am I feeling? Having that kind of body-based mindfulness, somatic mindfulness is so important, I think. It doesn't make it so much easier in a certain sense, because being in our bodies is not easy. I mean, there's a reason why we disconnect from our bodies in times of, social unrest. And we've been trained in the US and in different cultures, certainly in our culture, to disconnect from our bodies a lot. So this is like a training that we all get. And it's certainly a training that professional cultures get. I'm a lawyer, I know about this. It's a training that comes with elite education. It's like if you're in your body, then somehow you're not, accessing the higher faculties of cognition. All of these things help make it hard for us to, disrupt dominations. So having practices and creating communities of practice and support where we can feel again. Wow, that in and of itself is a way of disrupting oppression. Because again, one of the first, most powerful ways that oppression works is that we get disconnected from our soft-bellied, feeling-based bodies. And therefore, it's easier to maintain these notions of separation, these notions of social and cultural distance that support complicity with systems that are, every generation recreating the hierarchy. So we need to be in touch with our bodies, and to be that way and live that way is a kind of hard. It's especially hard for male bodies, right? It's especially hard for men, right? To kind of open up that space and be in touch with emotions and all of that.
Yeah. Well, there's kind of two parts. One of the phrases that you said in one of your meditations, I think, is to stay close to the body and avoid brain-based ways of processing life and your experiences, which I touched with that. And so I think the one thing for me, doing the somatic work, both through IFS and with, meditation, is that it's been a kind of a gateway, so because we talk a lot about emotional intelligence, which
Yes.
we need to identify with that. And a lot of the guided meditations in the book, they talk to us about, when you hear this, what do you feel? Not just in my body, but also kind of what emotions or thoughts are coming up. And I think one of the things that's worked for me, but because the emotional gateway for me, like I will feel the emotion, but being able to cognitively identify it, articulate it, and then mindfully let it be just present and honor it and hold space for it. That ending part, that's a little bit more, that's been a process. That's difficult. And so, but manifesting in the body, if I go to the body part first, because physicality for me has been working out, running, swimming, biking. I live through my body. And so when I can identify body parts that are manifesting whatever, it might be psychosomatic or it might be emotional. If I go to the body part, then from there, I can identify and attach an emotion to it. And then the lens for interpreting the emotion has been more clear for me personally. And so that's one of the things I really appreciate about that work and the embodiment of it. Because then if I can identify what emotion I'm feeling, then I can take a step beyond that and say, okay, why am I feeling afraid? Or why am I feeling anger toward this person or this situation, that kind of stuff. So that's the work that we've been doing. And so in our mindfulness package, we have 4 developments of the self. So know thyself, heal the self, be the self, share the self. And it's kind of within that context that the emotional intelligence piece kind of works in about knowing and then healing, because then we can go forth and do the other pieces with that. So, okay, so that's all really good. Again, I've got like 2 more pages and I had all these quotes we're going to read. How about just honoring your time? If is there anything, a quote or anything from the book you'd kind of like to close with? And then I always like to, I kind of wrap up podcasts talking about things that give you hope, because the journey that we've already talked about for almost 2 hours now. So thank you so much. You've been very gracious with your time. These are difficult topics, and we're asking and inviting people to be vulnerable, to engage each other with love and grace and some forgiveness and non-judgmental. And then we're asking people to do it for about 150 years so that we can work through it all. So all super easy, but Anyway, I just wondered, maybe a word on what gives you hope, and if there's anything from the book that you would like to close with. The one that I had, you did this a couple times opening up. One of the things you said, this must be ongoing, but you wrote it in individual words. And when you read it in the audiobook, it's this must be ongoing, and I like right away, I kind of like, okay, I think I know where this is going. But anyway, I just invite, if you want any wrap up that you'd like to do just to honor your time, and maybe just a couple of words of hope. And I'm just going to open with that. So I thought your book was really hopeful because the way it intersects so many things that I personally believe in and have identified with and have been really healing for me. And I hope, because I'm like really inspired right now a little bit about working with you to get permission to do some kind of, I don't know, twice a month, or just like an open invitation. And then I'm not quite sure yet, but just something to start having more conversations about it. Because I think we're at the point where that's possible, and and doing it in a restorative dialogue kind of way, but really mindful, of the issues that we're facing, but invite just, exchanges on difference and where we're at, what we're afraid of, who we want to be as a nation and or as a people, and that kind of stuff. So I'm kind of percolating on that. So I'll probably be pestering you some more down the road about that whole thing. So
I like your pestering. Yes.
Okay. So anyway, so I'm hopeful about all that, because I just think the more individual one-on-one conversations we can have and give people the tools to stay in it and know it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to be easy. But the journey, it'll be worth it over the long haul. So that's my little piece. So thank you, Professor Rhonda.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for that.
Please. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Okay. So any closing you'd like to share with us as we kind of wrap up?
I think I would like to just read a little bit from the last page or so from my book. Thank you so much for grounding us in this conversation, and for the honor of allowing the words that I presented in this work to kind of just be a part of how we create this space. I'd love to keep the conversation going in some way. In the last part of the book, I talk about, liberation as a part of this journey. And as you alluded, I am not suggesting actually that the linearity that the 5 parts that I present, inevitably tie into. We can feel some of the liberation of these practices in any moment, right? We're grounding, we're feeling a release. We're feeling, this kind of ease in our bodies. Starting out this part, I use a quote from one of the men a Black man who had engaged in a kind of a series of practices with me here in San Francisco, in which he basically, says, for the first time in memory, I'm feeling free. This is an elder Black man who's doing all of this kind of social activism work, through a lifetime of having seen a lot. And so for him to come out of this 7-week introduction to mindfulness, a mindfulness-based sort of intervention for engagement in the world, and for him to be saying, I'm feeling free, was very moving to me. But for me, it is about recognizing the poignancy of this moment where we're seeing a lot of evidence that the world around us is needing us to show up a lot differently, actually. In a certain sense, I really do believe that these crises that we're seeing are interrelated, and they are inviting us to look at the separations, not only between and amongst ourselves from our different lenses of race, but really how we're connecting to the entire planet, the other forms of life with which we're privileged to live on this planet. So seeing interconnectedness, feeling the harmful effects of the disconnects, and really being able to kind of stay present to that. And then from that place, discerning what action might be taken to help alleviate the suffering. And then doing something. That's really the call for this work. And I talk about how Colin Kaepernick, at the end of the book, I say, one of the most celebrated civil rights heroes of our day, Colin Kaepernick, makes plain that we resist out of love.
Love.
Right? Everything, I hope, this grace-filled way, this spacious way we're trying to hold this, I'm talking about a non-transactional, right, kind of what love looks like in public, to use Cornel West's statement about what justice might be, or, Martin Luther King and others have talked about how when we talk about justice, we're really talking about this sort of public care and concern that really we all deserve, but we have to start bringing it to ourselves. And so as I close, I say, so many of us fight for racial justice because of the love we feel in our hearts. Love that burns like a fire for those who have been harmed or killed by racism. I mean, let's just be honest. This is why we're doing this, because the stakes are very high. They have been historically, they continue to be. Even not just, when we think of the extreme instances like George Floyd's killing and, public killing, the subtle killing of disproportionate impact and lethality of the coronavirus. The impacts of racism are so serious that we really do deserve, right? And we owe it to ourselves, if we really want to be living our values of care and concern, to really look at the lives of people who have been impacted by racism as a guide for how we might understand it better, but also deepen our ability to stay in this. Because those of us who are being impacted day to day, we don't have a choice. So if you're in a position where you feel like you have a choice as to whether or not you turn toward this, right there's already an indication of a certain kind of privilege. So I think of it as really inviting us to be in this continual conversation, because as I write in the book, I've suffered enough, you've suffered enough, we have all suffered enough around racism. And so in this time where we're aware of our radical interconnectedness and the impermanence of life, the fact that we have these moments, we never know how much longer we have. If we can create more spaces for us to come together, work together, feel our way into a new way of being, I think a new story of humanity is wanting to be born. I'm here for that. And I think the practices of mindfulness and compassion, and really the love underneath them, really are support for all of us as we do our part of the work, because we all have a part of it. So thank you so much.
Thanks all. Well, then how about if I read the last little poem that you put on the very last page? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
All right. May the ocean of our healing, your river meeting mine, bring peace. Renew the places and spaces we share, and strengthen the currents running through us of justice, of just this, unceasingly. So, okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was great. And then, I'll put my little thoughts together and send it to you, and you can nudge along the way, and we'll see what happens. So, all right, wishing you the very, very best. I appreciate it. Just great work, and see if we can't find ways. And when we get out to the Bay Area, I'll pester you again, and then I'll come by the law school or whatever you're doing. So that'd be great.
Exactly. Go for a walk on the beach somewhere.
That would be great. All right. Thank you so much. You take care. All right.
You too.